Noah's silhouette cut through Red Willow's icy dawn, the sack of firewood scraping a scar across the road. No one looked, no one spoke, until Elias stepped forward, his breath a fragile bridge between them. His hand on the sack was a spark, waking a town's hidden guilt, and Daniel Whitaker's name flared in the frost like a wound reopened. This isn't about fire's rage. It's about the hands that choose to carry its light. The town of Red Willow woke slowly beneath a skin of pale winter fog. Frost clung to the dirt road like a memory it didn't want to release. In that half-light, a small figure emerged from the tree line, the weight of a burlap sack dragging behind him. The rope cut into Noah Whitaker's palm, the fibers stiff with cold and years of use. Every few steps, his right shoe slid in the hardened mud, leaving faint, crack marks that looked more like fractures than footprints. The sack scraped against the ground with a dry, hollow sound, as if the wood inside it had forgotten it once carried fire. The boy's breath came out in small, uneven clouds. He was 12, though the curve of his shoulders suggested someone older, someone who had carried too much for too long. Red Willow was not a loud town. Its silence wasn't gentle either. It was the kind that left rooms colder after you walked through them. Windows along the main road were fogged from kitchen stoves. But no curtains stirred. No one waved. They had all learned how to look away without moving their eyes. Noah didn't look up. He rarely did. The rope tightened in his hand when the sack snagged on a rock, jerking him back a half step. He didn't swear or sigh. He just pulled harder until it moved again. That was how most things went in his life. Nothing gave way unless you tore a piece of yourself to drag it forward. Past the square, the trees thinned and the edge of the forest showed itself. And step out into the cold. Today was no different, except that his hand trembled when he tied the knot at the top of the bag. Not from the chill. From something deeper that had no name. Only a pressure in his chest that came and went like weather. Halfway down the hill, the wind shifted, carrying the metallic bite of distant snow. His fingers raw from the rope. He thought of her small hand on his wrist last night, her voice a whisper, "Come back fast." She always said it like she was asking for a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Noah adjusted his grip, leaning his weight against the rope as the sack slid over a rut in the frozen dirt. The sound it made, wood against earth, echoed louder than it should have in the empty morning. A sound like dragging a burden no one wanted to claim. As he neared the first houses, a curtain shifted. A figure moved behind the glass, then stilled. He didn't glance over. He knew the routine. People saw him the way the town saw that old fire. Something half-buried, better left untouched. His shoulders tightened anyway. The instinctive flinch of someone who had learned that attention rarely meant kindness. The market's outline appeared ahead, a scatter of rooftops against the gray sky. He could already smell the butcher's shop, the sour tang of blood and water. The rope cut deeper into his palm, leaving faint grooves. He held it tighter, not because he feared dropping it, but because the weight reminded him he was still here, still moving, still trying. For a moment, as the fog rolled low over the road, Noah's reflection appeared in a puddle of half-frozen water. A thin boy with eyes too tired for 12. He stepped over it without looking again, the sack dragging behind him like an echo. And somewhere beyond the edge of the square, a sound lingered faintly under the wind, the low, distant hum of an engine moving closer. He didn't hear it. Not yet. At the far edge of Red Willow, where the road thinned into a trail of packed earth and pine needles, Noah's house waited the way an abandoned dog waits, still, patient, expecting nothing. The boards had gone gray with weather and time. The porch sloped slightly forward, pulling the whole frame with it, as if the weight of 5 hard winters had bent its spine. Watched it hang in the air before it dissolved into the morning chill. His fingers tightened around the rope one last time before letting it fall. For a moment he just stood there, listening. The wind moved through the trees, soft enough to sound like a voice you couldn't quite hear. Inside, the air held that faint, stale cold of a place that had learned to survive without heat. The single-room cabin opened directly into a small kitchen, the wood stove in the corner long cooled to a silent hulk of iron. Against the far wall, a narrow bed sat close to a stone hearth that carried more soot than flame. On the bed lay Lena, 7 years old, her thin frame curled under a threadbare blanket. Her hair spilled dark across the pillow, matted in places from nights of restless coughing. Noah set his hand gently on the doorframe, the wood worn smooth under his palm. He didn't speak right away. He never did. His eyes lingered on his sister's small shoulders rising and falling in shallow rhythm. That sound, the fragile breath of someone fighting for warmth, had become his anchor. He let the door close behind him softly, careful not to wake her yet. He crossed the room and crouched by the bed, brushing a few strands of hair from her face. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, a reflex born of recognition. Noah exhaled slowly, letting the quiet press against his chest until it hurt. On the table beside the bed sat a folded piece of paper, the edges curled from damp. The handwriting was faint, uneven, the ink bled into the fibers. His mother's hand. He'd stopped reading it months ago, not because he forgot the words, but because he couldn't forget them. If I'm gone, please don't leave the children. They are innocent. Believe them, even if no one else will. Noah traced the edge of the paper with one finger, not touching the words themselves. That small motion was the only time he let himself remember her voice. He could still hear her in the space between coughs and wind, soft, tired, holding everything together with sheer will. A soft rasp broke the quiet. Lena's eyes opened, dark and glassy. You came back, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Yeah, he murmured, though it came out like an apology. Her hand reached out from under the blanket, small fingers finding his wrist. It's cold. I know. His other hand covered hers, his skin rough against her fever-warm palm. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, carrying years of nights without parents, days of dragging wood, moments of almost giving up. When her eyes drifted shut again, Noah stood slowly. He crossed the corner where the woodpile leaned against the wall, just 5 pieces left. He ran his hand over the rough grain, felt the splinters catch at his skin. He didn't light the stove. Not yet. The wood had to last. By the window, the glass was cracked, a piece of cardboard wedged into the gap to keep out the worst of the wind. He pressed his palm against it anyway, the chill seeping into his bones. Outside, the forest stood black and quiet, the same trees that had burned that night, their trunks scarred but still standing. Noah's eyes drifted to the corner shelf where the old badge sat, a bronze disc tarnished to near black, faint letters still readable. Daniel Whitaker, Fire Department. He swallowed hard. His father's name felt heavy even in thought, like lifting something that had been buried too long. Behind him, Lena stirred and murmured in her sleep, a sound half-cough, half-word. He didn't catch it, but he knew the tone. It was the same one she used every night. Come back fast. Noah picked up the rope again. The sack outside waited where he dropped it. The day wasn't done. It was never done. He stepped out into the gray light once more, pulling the weight behind him. The door creaked closed, leaving the faint sound of his sister's breathing inside. The rope bit into his palm again, carving fresh grooves over old ones. Down the hill, the fog had started to thin. Somewhere beyond it, a sound rumbled low and steady, the hum of an engine he couldn't see yet. By the time Noah reached the lower slope, the fog had thinned into threads, curling between the crooked rooftops of Red Willow's Market Square. The first sounds of morning had begun, the metallic rattle of shutters being lifted, the faint clink of glass jars set on wooden counters. Somewhere a door slammed against the frame, sharp and impatient, breaking the brittle quiet. Noah adjusted his grip on the rope, his fingers stiff with cold, and pulled the sack across the uneven ground. The weight dragged at his shoulders like a hand pressing him into the earth. His breath came slower now, each exhale a visible cloud that vanished before it rose. The butcher's shop stood at the center of the square, the sign above it swinging slightly in the breeze, its paint flaking to reveal older layers beneath. The smell reached him before the door did. Raw meat, salt, and a sour trace of yesterday's wash water. He kept his eyes down as he passed the first few stalls, carrying the metallic tang of ice and something faintly bitter from the butcher's drain. His foot caught on a rut in the frozen dirt, and the sack jerked sideways, the rough scrape of wood against earth louder than the murmurs around him. The butcher's door swung open with a squeal. Martha Kane stepped out, her apron already stained, her face lined in a way that made every glance feel like judgment. Her eyes landed on the sack, on the boy behind it. You dragging that damn thing through here again? Her voice cut the air, sharp and unyielding, bouncing off the closed windows like a warning bell. Noah didn't answer. He bent slightly, adjusting the rope, trying to ease the weight onto his other shoulder. The sack tilted as he moved, one side tearing a little more along the frayed seam. A log rolled free, bumping along the dirt until it came to rest against Martha's leather boot. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The square seemed to hold its breath. Martha looked down at the log, then back at the boy. Her expression didn't change. She stepped back inside without a word. Noah reached forward, fingers numb, ready to grab the runaway piece. The sound came first, a slosh, quick and deliberate, then the impact. Cold water hit his face and chest in a single, filthy wave. He blinked once, wiped nothing away, and bent to gather the log. Behind him, someone muttered. Another set of footsteps scuffed against the ground, then turned away. The market didn't stop. It never did. Noah cradled the piece of wood against his chest for warmth it didn't have. His fingers stiff, skin split at the knuckles. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. He simply reached for the next log in the sack, methodical, quiet, as if every movement had to be done slowly to keep from breaking something inside him. A faint giggle floated across the square. A child's voice again, unguarded, asking a question Noah couldn't hear this time. The answer was silence, followed by the soft creak of a door closing. We finally gathered the last piece back into the torn sack. Noah tied the seam with a strip of cloth ripped from his own sleeve. The rope slid over his palm, wet now, and left a faint red mark where skin had cracked under the pressure. He stood there for a moment, the cold soaking into him, the square moving around him like he wasn't there at all. Then, without a word, he bent his shoulders forward and pulled the sack back into motion. The sound of it dragging over the dirt was louder than before, as though the wood itself carried the echo of everything the town didn't say. Above the square, the clouds hung heavy, thick enough to mute the sun. The day hadn't even begun, and already it felt long. Noah tightened his grip and kept walking, every step measured, every breath quiet enough not to disturb the silence that had swallowed Red Willow whole. The cold didn't leave him. It clung, soaking through the thin cotton of his shirt, settling into his bones like it had been waiting for a way in. Noah shifted his shoulders under the weight of the sack, the rope biting deeper into his palm, now slick with a mix of water and blood. He tried not to shiver. Shivering wasted strength, and he needed every ounce of it to make it through the square without dropping to his knees. The ground sloped slightly upward ahead. A thin trail of muddy ice cut down the center where wagon wheels had passed in the thaw and freeze of winter. His shoes slid on the incline, the worn soles offering nothing against the frozen ruts. He planted one foot carefully, then the other, leaning his entire weight into the rope as the sack scraped behind him. A voice rose behind him, not sharp like Martha's, but low and muttered. Shouldn't even be out here. Another voice answered with a sigh. Leave it. Not our business. Noah's shoulders tightened instinctively. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the ground in front of him, on the faint crack running through the ice. If he looked up, if he met their eyes, he knew what he'd see. Not anger. Not pity. Just the emptiness of people who had decided something didn't matter. At the top of the slope, the rope slipped suddenly in his grip, jerking his hand. Pain flashed through his palm as the fibers scraped raw skin. He sucked in a breath through his teeth, not loud enough to be heard. The sack tilted dangerously, and for a heartbeat he thought it would spill again. He shifted, using his knee to catch the edge, the motion practice from too many mornings just like this. One piece of wood had worked itself loose near the torn seam. He reached down to push it back, and the movement sent another drop of cold water sliding down his neck, tracing his spine like a finger. He paused, eyes shut for half a second, then forced himself upright. A door creaked open to his left. The faint smell of bread wafted out with a burst of warm air. He didn't glance over. He heard the soft scuff of shoes on the threshold, a pause, then the sound of the door sliding shut again. The square seemed to contract around him. Every sound, boots on frozen dirt, the creak of a cart, the clink of metal on wood, felt amplified, pushing against the quiet inside his chest. He tightened his grip on the rope until his hand trembled from the strain, until he couldn't tell if it was from cold or something else. At the far edge of the market, a group of boys about his age had gathered, their breath puffing out in white bursts as they laughed at something unseen. One of them noticed him first, elbowed the others, and the laughter shifted. He didn't hear the words, only the tone, a sharpness that pricked at the air like a splinter. not from the slope or the sack, but from the weight pressing down from all directions. The market wasn't loud, but it was full of soundless things, judgment, memory. The echo of a night when fire turned his family name into something people whispered. Halfway through the square, the rope slipped again. His hand opened before he could stop it. The sack dropped the last few inches to the ground with a dull thud that sounded far too much like defeat. For a moment, he didn't move. His shoulders curved inward, his breath caught in his throat. The sound of it dragging across the ground louder than his own footsteps. He told himself not to think about the warmth of the bread behind the closed door, or the sound of the boys' laughter fading into the wind. He told himself to keep moving, always moving, because if he stopped, even for a second, the weight might never lift again. And above the quiet hum of the square, faint but growing, there it was once more, the low rumble of an engine rolling closer through the fog. The sound of the engine was still distant, muffled beneath the wind when the rope gave way. It wasn't dramatic. There was no snap, no violent jerk, just a soft, tired tear like something that held on too long finally letting go. The sack lurched forward and tipped, spilling its weight onto the frozen dirt. The first log bounced once, then twice, before rolling lazily down the slope, scattering like the pieces of a life he had tried too hard to keep together. Noah dropped to his knees before the sack had even settled, fingers scrambling for the runaway pieces. The cold bit at his skin, his palms sliding over mud and ice, catching on splinters. He gathered one log against his chest, then another, his breath hitching with each movement, though no sound left his throat. The market slowed, but didn't stop. A woman stepped around him carefully, lifting her skirt to avoid the mud. A man adjusted the strap of his satchel and kept walking, the air filled with the faint scrape of boots, avoiding the small shape in the dirt. One piece of wood rolled farther than the others, bumping against the black leather of Martha Kane's boots. She stared down at it for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, without a word, she stepped back into the butcher's shop. The door swung shut with a dull click. Noah reached for the last piece near him, and the movement drove a sharp edge of wood across the side of his hand. The skin split easily, the blood bright against the gray-brown of winter. He didn't flinch. He only held it tighter, pressing the wounded hand against the log as if warmth could come from holding on hard enough. The gray sky above him bending as if the ground had shifted. He crouched back down, resting one knee in the slush. His hands worked automatically, sliding broken pieces of rope through torn seams, tying them into a knot that would hold just long enough. It always did. By the time the last log was back inside the sack, his breath came fast and shallow. He pushed up to his feet slowly, dragging the weight upright. The sack felt heavier now, though nothing had changed but him. He took one step, then another, and halfway to the next stall his knees gave. There was no sound when he hit the ground, just the soft thud of a body too light for its own burden. His cheek met the cold dirt, the smell of mud and old ash filling his nose. His fingers didn't let go of the rope. Even in collapse, he held on. The square went silent in a way it hadn't been all morning. No one rushed forward. A door closed somewhere far away. The wind shifted. Noah's eyes opened just enough to catch a blur of boots passing. Someone stepped over him like he was nothing more than a puddle left by last night's melt. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Only a thin cloud of breath escaped, fading quickly into the gray. The logs lay scattered again, a broken halo around him. He turned his head slightly, cheek dragging against the frozen ground, until his eyes landed on the nearest piece. The grain of the wood held the faint outline of something that looked like a bird's wing. He stared at it. He lay there in the center of it all, still clutching the rope, a boy-shaped silence on a road no one wanted to claim. And through that heavy quiet, closer now, the engine's hum rolled over the square, a sound that didn't belong to Red Willow's silence. It was steady, deliberate, carrying with it the weight of someone who had learned to stop turning away. The hum broke into the square like a low growl under the wind. It wasn't loud, but in Red Willow's hollow morning, it sounded like the earth itself shifting. Tires bit into frozen dirt, scattering bits of ice as the vehicle slowed. People turned, not in alarm, but in that quiet, careful way small towns do when something unfamiliar arrives. The truck came into view through the thinning fog, a military issue left over from a war most of them had already folded into memory. The paint was dulled to a muted green, dusted in frost. the kind of machine that had seen more roads than homes. It rolled to a stop at the edge of the square, the engine rumbling low for a moment before cutting into silence. The door opened with a metallic groan. A man stepped down, his boots hitting the dirt with a weight that made a few heads turn and then look away. His coat was thick, the collar pulled high against the cold, but the way he moved said soldier before anything else did. Broad shoulders, straight spine, a gait that had learned to measure every step. Elias Monroe scanned the square once, his eyes cutting through the slow drift of fog and settling on the small, crumpled shape near the center. The boy hadn't moved. Logs lay scattered like discarded bones. A rope trailed limp from one small hand still curled tight. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look at the people watching from doorways and windows. He let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Easy, he murmured, not sure if the boy could hear. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of someone used to giving orders that mattered. He slid one arm under Noah's back, the other beneath his knees, and lifted. The boy weighed less than the sack he'd been dragging. When Elias stood, the square felt tighter somehow, the quiet thicker. Eyes peeked from behind curtains, over shoulders, then darted away. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. He looked up, wrapping him closer against his chest, as if the cold might try to steal what little warmth remained. His eyes found the butcher's door still shut tight. The bakery window where shadow had been a moment ago now empty. If this is how you treat a child, he said, quieter this time, then this isn't a town. It's just a place people hide. Noah stirred faintly in his arms, a soft, broken sound leaving his lips. Elias looked down, catching a glimpse of a face too young to be this tired. Something twisted in his chest, not pity. He pulled a blanket, coarse and olive green, and wrapped it around the boy's thin frame. For a second, he paused, his hand brushing the edge of Noah's collar where skin met cloth. A small crescent-shaped scar curved along the boy's neck, pale against the chill. Elias froze. The shape hit him like a memory snapping open. He'd seen that mark before, in firelight, in smoke, on a night that had haunted every breath since. His hand lingered a moment longer before he pulled it back, fingers curling into a fist. He shut the truck door gently, as if noise might undo something fragile in the air. Behind him, the square remained still, every window and doorway holding its breath. Elias didn't look back. He climbed into the driver's seat, the engine coughing to life under his hands. As the truck rolled forward, carrying the boy out of Red Willow's silent center, the wind swept through the market, stirring the scattered logs. They knocked softly against each other, a sound small enough to be missed unless you were listening for the weight of something finally breaking. The truck moved slow over the rutted road, the other resting lightly on the edge of the seat, close enough to reach back if the boy stirred. Noah lay in the back, wrapped in the coarse olive blanket, lips pressed tight in the kind of sleep that wasn't rest but surrender. The town slipped away behind them with every turn. Elias didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of it in his shoulders, in the way the silence seemed to follow the truck like a shadow. The forest closed in on both sides as the road narrowed. Tall pines leaned toward the dirt track, their trunks marked with old fire scars. The scent of char and earth hit him in waves, faint but undeniable. It smelled like memory. Elias shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under his coat. His fingers tapped once against the steering wheel, a restless habit he hadn't kicked since the war. He glanced at the mirror again, at the boy's stillness, and that scar on his neck flickered in his mind like a flare in the dark. He knew that mark, not the shape, not the curve of it. He knew the moment it had been made. The night the warehouse burned. The night a man named Daniel Whitaker had run into a wall of fire with a child in his arms. Elias swallowed hard, the memory scraping against his throat. The radio had been crackling that night. Voices shouting over each other, the sound of things collapsing in the background. Whitaker's inside. He's carrying a kid, still alive. Then the explosion. Then nothing. His grip tightened on the wheel until the leather groaned. He forced himself to ease it, one breath at a time. He had told himself for 5 years that night was sealed, buried under reports and silence. But the boy in the back of his truck had just pulled the lid off a grave Elias had never dared to dig. A soft sound broke his thoughts. A cough, dry and shallow. From under the blanket, Elias glanced in the mirror. Noah's eyes were half open now, unfocused, blinking against the dim light. "You're safe," Elias said, the words low, almost instinct. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, like it had to travel through something thick before reaching the air. Noah shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. "Where?" His voice cracked, thin from cold and exhaustion. "Out of the square. That's all you need right now." Elias's eyes stayed on the road, the trees flashing by in narrow strips of black and white. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of the engine and the uneven breath of a boy who had carried too much for too long. Then Noah's voice again, softer this time. "My sister." Elias's jaw clenched. They carried 5 years of silence he was no longer willing to keep. The truck rounded a bend, and the trees opened to reveal a stretch of road lined with snow-dusted grass. In the distance, through the thin fog, Elias could see the faint outline of a slanted roof leaning into the wind. He slowed the truck to a crawl, the engine dropping to a low murmur. "That your place?" Noah's eyes barely lifted, but the way his fingers clutched the blanket was answer enough. Elias pulled the truck to a stop at the edge of the narrow path leading up to the cabin. He killed the engine, and the sudden quiet pressed in from all sides. The kind of quiet that remembered fire and loss. He sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, staring at the crooked porch and the faint line of smoke stains on the walls. Then he exhaled and opened the door. The cold hit him full in the face, sharp and honest. He had seen this before. Not this house, but others like it, the kind left standing after the world had already burned them down from the inside. He adjusted his grip on Noah. Elias set him down gently on the top step. "Stay here a second." He reached for the door, fingers brushing over the worn handle. It opened with a soft groan, not locked, not even latched. Inside, the air was sharp with cold, and something else beneath it, smoke, faint but lingering, like the walls themselves still remembered. The first thing he saw was the bed. Small, pushed close to the hearth. The thin blanket curled into itself, as if it were hiding someone fragile. A cough broke the quiet, dry and shallow, and then a pair of dark eyes blinked open. Lena Whitaker was smaller than he expected, her frame swallowed by the blanket, her hair a tangle of shadows across the pillow. She stared at him without fear, without surprise. The way a child looks at weather they have already learned to live with. Noah's voice came from the doorway, thin but steady. "It's okay, Lena." He helped. Her gaze shifted to her brother, and for the first time, something in her face softened. "You came back," she said, her voice rasping like paper tearing. "I told you I would." Noah stepped inside, his legs trembling but sure. He knelt by the bed, taking her small hand in both of his. Elias stood in the doorway a moment longer, letting the scene breathe. His eyes caught on the table against the wall, where a single folded piece of paper sat under a cracked ceramic cup. The edges were curled, the ink faded but still readable. He picked it up carefully, the weight of it far heavier than the paper itself. The handwriting was uneven, but the words were clear. "If I'm gone, please don't leave the children. They are innocent. Believe them, even if no one else will." Elias set the note back down slowly, his fingers lingering on the edge. He looked at the two small figures by the bed, the boy's shoulders curved protectively, the girl's tiny hand gripping his like an anchor, and something deep in his chest shifted, a crack forming in a wall he hadn't realized was still there. He stepped further into the room, his boots soft against the worn wood. "She needs heat," he said quietly. "And a doctor." Noah nodded once, his lips pressed tight. "I couldn't. I didn't have enough." His voice trailed off into the cold air. Elias crouched beside the hearth, running his fingers over the empty grate. The smell of old smoke clung to the bricks. He could see where a small hand had tried to clean it once and given up halfway. "I'll get it going," he murmured, though he wasn't just talking about the fire. Lena's eyes followed him as he moved, unblinking, curious in the way children are when they sense something important happening without knowing why. "Are you a soldier?" she asked softly. Elias paused, the match in his hand hovering over the kindling. "I was. Are you a good person?" The question cut sharper than any accusation. He closed his eyes for half a second before answering. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I used to think so. Then I wasn't sure anymore." Lena's gaze didn't waver. "But you didn't leave my brother behind." Elias struck the match. The flame flared briefly. Noah tightened his hold on Lena's hand. Elias sat back on his heels, watching the first thin threads of smoke curl upward. The cabin still smelled of old fire, but for the first time, It also smelled of something else, hope, faint and trembling, but there. The fire took its time catching. Elias stayed, crouched by the hearth, coaxing the flame with steady hands, adding one piece of kindling at a time, like each movement carried weight beyond wood and smoke. The room warmed slowly, not enough to chase away the chill clinging to the walls, but enough that Lena's fingers relaxed slightly in her brother's grasp. Noah shifted to sit beside the bed, his shoulders sagging with something more than exhaustion. He kept his eyes on his sister, though every so often they flickered to the fire like he was afraid it might vanish if he looked away too long. Elias stood finally, his knees popping quietly in the stillness. His gaze swept the small room, taking in the patched walls, the uneven floorboards, the worn table against the far side. It wasn't until his eyes landed on the shelf above the window that his breath caught. The badge sat alone, its bronze dulled with age and smoke, edges tarnished to near black. His hand hovered a moment before touching it, the cold metal biting against his skin. He turned it over once, twice, the weight of it far heavier than it should have been. Behind him, Noah's voice came quietly, carrying that strange mix of defiance and apology children sometimes learn too early. It was my dad's. Elias didn't turn immediately. His thumb traced the edge of the badge, the small chips where heat had bitten into metal. I know, he said finally, though the words sounded like they belonged to someone else. He could hear the echo of that night in the back of his skull, the crackle of radio static, the shouted name over the chaos. Whitaker's inside. He's carrying a kid. Then the sound of collapsing beams, the blast of heat, and silence so absolute it still woke him sometimes. He set the badge back gently, as if returning something fragile. His hand lingered on the shelf a second longer, fingers curling into the grain of the wood. Noah's eyes were on him now, wary but searching. They said he started it. His voice didn't tremble. It was too tired for that. Elias turned then, meeting the boy's gaze. There it was, the same look he'd seen in smoke and firelight 5 years ago. A look too old for a 12-year-old face. Did you believe them? Noah shook his head once, small and sharp. He wouldn't. Not ever. Lena stirred, her small voice rasping out between them. Mama said he'd try to save us. Both of us. Elias's throat tightened. The memory of the scar on Noah's neck flashed again, that faint crescent he had seen in the dark. His hand flexed unconsciously, the urge to reach for the boy stronger than he expected. He stepped back to the table and picked up the folded paper again, reading the lines he already knew by heart. They are innocent. Believe them even if no one else will. When he looked back at the siblings, something inside him shifted. 4 or 5 years, he had carried the weight of that night like a sealed box. Telling himself silence was duty, that the past didn't matter as long as the fire was out. But here it was breathing, shivering under a thin blanket, staring at him with Daniel Whitaker's eyes. Elias sat on the edge of the bed carefully, the old wood creaking under his weight. Your father, he said slowly. He didn't run. He went into the fire, carrying someone small. I saw him. Noah's shoulders stiffened, his fingers tightening around his sister's. Then, why? He didn't finish the question. Elias looked at the fire, the small flames licking at the wood. Because sometimes people bury the wrong things. And sometimes we let them. The boy didn't answer. He just lowered his head until his forehead rested against Lena's hand. She squeezed his fingers weakly, her lips moving in a whisper Elias couldn't hear. He leaned back slightly, letting the silence settle again. The fire cracked once, sending a soft plume of sparks up the chimney. The badge on the shelf caught the light briefly, a dull glint like an eye opening after a long sleep. Elias reached for another log, feeding it to the growing flame. His hands moved automatically, but his mind was somewhere else. 5 years ago, smoke thick in his lungs, the sound of a man's voice yelling through fire. And a choice he hadn't made then. This time, he thought, watching the 2 small figures huddled on the bed, there would be no turning away. The fire had begun to settle into a steady rhythm, each crackle a soft heartbeat against the quiet. Heat crawled outward slowly, nudging back the cold that had claimed the cabin for so long. Lena shifted under her blanket, her cheeks faintly flushed now, though her breathing was still shallow. Elias sat at the table with the folded note between his hands, the paper gone soft at the creases. The words blurred slightly at the edges, not from wear but from memory pressing too close. He set it down carefully, almost ceremonially, and rubbed at his jaw as though the motion might loosen something locked there for years. Noah was by the hearth, turning a log over in his hands. Not to add it to the fire, but as if reminding himself it was real, that warmth could come from something other than pulling weight through frost. His eyes drifted now and then to the shelf, to the badge resting in its lonely place. "You were there," Noah said suddenly. His voice wasn't accusing. It wasn't even questioning. Just a quiet statement laid in the air like kindling waiting for a spark. Elias looked up slowly. "At the fire?" Noah's small nod was all the answer needed. Elias leaned back in the chair, the old wood groaning. "Yeah, I was there." The admission felt heavier than the words themselves. Elias's hand moved almost unconsciously to his coat pocket. He withdrew a small, battered lighter, the once shiny surface worn to dull metal. He turned it over in his palm, the motion slow, deliberate. "Your dad, when they called his name over the radio, I was close enough to hear him. I saw him go in." His voice tightened around the memory. He wasn't running away from anything. He was running into it, carrying someone. Noah's fingers clenched around the log until his knuckles went white. "They said," he stopped, the words catching like splinters. "They said he made it worse. They were wrong." Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The steadiness in the words cut deeper than anger ever could. Lena opened her eyes slowly, her voice a thin thread. "Mama said he tried to get us out. I remember his arms. I remember the heat." Elias swallowed hard. The image flared in his mind. A man silhouetted in firelight. A small shape clutched to his chest, the sound of a beam giving way above them. He'd buried that sight under reports, under silence, under duty, but had never gone away. He set the lighter on the table and pushed it slightly toward Noah. He didn't start it. He didn't run. Whatever they told you, it wasn't the truth. Noah's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was something in them beyond exhaustion. A spark, fragile, almost fearful, but there. "Why didn't you say anything?" The boy's voice was soft, but the question landed like a stone. Elias let the quiet stretch before answering. "Because I thought silence kept the pain from spreading. I thought I was protecting someone. Maybe myself." His hand curled slightly on the table. "I was wrong." Lena shifted, her small hand reaching out blindly until it found Noah's sleeve. He covered it with his own quickly. Steadying her touch, Elias stood and crossed to the shelf. His fingers brushed the badge again, lifting it into the firelight. "He went into that building for love. That's the only thing I know for certain, and it's the only thing that matters now." He placed the badge gently into Noah's hands. The boy held it like something living, his shoulders curling protectively around it. The fire cracked louder, a brief flare sending shadows dancing across the walls. For a moment, the cabin seemed to breathe. The old smoke scent lingered, but now it mingled with something warmer, something almost clean. Elias sat back down slowly, his eyes on the two children. He felt the weight of years pressing on him, and beneath it, the first small shift of something loosening. Smoke from the hearth curled upward in thin threads, carrying with it the faintest hint of release. Outside, the wind shifted through the pines, their long needles brushing against each other with a hollow whisper. The cabin seemed to lean into that sound, as if the old would recognize it. Elias sat at the table with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards. The fire popped once, sending a soft crack through the quiet, but it did little to push away the heaviness settling over the room. Noah hadn't moved since Elias placed the badge in his hands. He sat cross-legged on the floor now, the metal clutched to his chest, his head bowed in a way that looked less like prayer and more like survival. Lena dozed fitfully on the bed, her small hands still tangled in her brother's sleeve. The faint rise and fall of her breath, the only proof she was still tethered here. Elias rubbed his hands together, though not for warmth. It was a nervous motion, the kind that betrayed a man who spent years keeping his body still while his mind fought wars no one could see. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again. The words weren't ready. Or maybe they were too ready and too heavy to let out. He stood finally and crossed to the window. The cardboard patch rattled slightly under the wind. Through the crack at the edge, He could see the faint smear of gray sky above the tree line. Red Willow lay out there, quiet as ever, its roofs hunched under the weight of a cold no fire seemed to reach. He thought about the square, about the way people stepped around the boy like he wasn't there. He thought about the night 5 years ago when the sky glowed orange and everything smelled of ash. He pressed his palm against the window frame, the wood rough beneath his skin. "I heard your father scream," he said suddenly, his voice low but carrying in the stillness. Not fear, not pain. He was calling for someone. Noah lifted his head slowly, his fingers tightening around the badge. "For us," he said, his voice quiet but certain. Elias turned back to him, and for a moment, his chest ached with the sharpness of truth spoken without hesitation. He sat down again, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. "I should have said something then. I should have fought harder. But I didn't. I let them write their reports. I let the silence settle." He exhaled, a sound heavy enough to bend the air. "And every day since, I've wondered if the fire ever really went out." Noah looked down at the badge, his thumb brushing over the faint engraving of his father's name. "They made us ghosts," he said softly, not as an accusation, but as if naming a fact that had hung in the air too long. Elias closed his eyes for a beat. "I know." His hands tightened into fists on his knees. "But ghosts don't stay quiet forever." The fire crackled again, the warmth creeping further across the room. Elias glanced at Lena, her fragile frame curled beneath the blanket, and something inside him shifted. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was a crack in the wall he'd built around a memory. The first breath of air in a place that had been sealed too long. "I can't give you back what you lost," he said, his voice rough. "But I can stop pretending it didn't happen. I can stop letting them bury the truth." Noah's gaze met his, steady now despite the exhaustion pulling at his small frame. "Then start," the boy whispered. Elias nodded once. A small movement that carried the weight of a promise. He reached for the folded note again, the paper soft under his fingers. The words stared back at him, written by a hand that had been gone too long, but somehow still guided the room. "Believe them even if no one else will." He slipped the note carefully into his coat pocket and stood. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Tomorrow we start digging." The fire hissed as a log shifted, sending a small shower of sparks upward. The cabin held the sound like a secret, the walls absorbing it into their old, scarred wood. Noah leaned back against the bed frame, the badge still pressed to his chest. His eyes fluttered once, exhaustion pulling him under. Before they closed completely, he murmured he didn't run. Elias's throat tightened. He looked at the small boy curled on the floor, the little girl breathing softly on the bed. And for the first time in 5 years, he let the weight of silence break inside him. It didn't make a sound when it cracked. It never does. But in the soft glow of the firelight, with the smell of old smoke mingling with new warmth, something long buried began to rise. Night pressed against the cabin like a second set of walls. The fire had burned down to a bed of embers, their faint orange glow painting the room in soft, uneven light. Elias sat on the floor this time, his back against the opposite wall, knees bent and arms resting loosely on them. His eyes weren't closed, but they weren't entirely open either. He was somewhere between the crackle of the fire and the roar of memory. Noah lay curled near the hearth, Lena's small hand still in his. The badge rested between them, its dull bronze catching every flicker of light like a heartbeat. Elias watched the faint rise and fall of their shoulders and thought about how many nights had passed like this in silence. How many more would, if someone didn't tear the quiet open? His gaze drifted to the ceiling. The wood beams darkened in places where smoke had kissed them years ago. He could almost hear it, the groan of timber, the frantic voices over the radio, the sudden, gutting blast that had cut them all off. He had told himself for years that he'd done all he could that night, that there was nothing left to say. But the smell of char never really left his coat. No matter how many times he washed it, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, worn photograph folded into quarters. He didn't look at it right away. His thumb traced the crease where the paper had split slightly at the edges. Then, slowly he opened it. A grainy image stared back, 2 faces half caught in motion. A man with a soot-streaked jawline. In this small room with its thin walls and its fragile warmth, he couldn't look away. A soft cough broke the silence. Elias turned his head to see Lena stirring, her eyes half open, glinting in the firelight. She blinked at him slowly. "You knew him," she rasped, her voice raw but certain. Elias set the photo down gently on the floor between them. "Yet," he said. His voice sounded old in his own ears. "I knew him." She shifted slightly, the blanket rustling. Was he scared? Elias stared at the photo, at the man's blurred outline running into fire instead of away from it. He shook his head once, slow. No, not for himself. Her small hand moved, brushing the edge of the photo. Her fingers lingered there, delicate against the paper. Mama said, he told her we'd be okay. Even if, she trailed off, her eyes drifting shut again. Even if, Elias finished softly. The wind outside picked up, sliding between the trees and around the cabin like a long breath. Elias leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes for the first time in hours. The fire crackled faintly, carrying with it the scent of smoke and pine. He could feel the weight of what came next settling on his shoulders. The town, the reports. Elias opened his eyes and looked at the note on the table one more time. Believe them, even if no one else will. The words seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, like embers refusing to die. He picked up the photograph and slid it carefully into his pocket, close to his chest. Then he reached over and pulled another blanket from the chair, laying it gently over Noah and Lena. The boy stirred faintly, his fingers curling around the badge as if to keep it from slipping into the dark. Elias sat back, letting the warmth of the embers reach his hands. His mind was already moving quietly, methodically. There were people he needed to find, records buried under dust and lies. A fire to dig through all over again, this time with no water to put it out. He glanced once more at the sleeping children, their faces soft in the glow, and felt the first real piece of resolve settle in his chest. Tomorrow, the digging would begin. Tonight, the cabin would hold its quiet, not the silence of forgetting, but the fragile stillness of something about to change. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of old ash through the trees, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to finally speak. Morning seeped into the cabin not with light, but with a pale grayness that blurred the edges of everything. Elias woke before the children stirred, his back stiff from the floorboards. His coat bunched beneath his head. For a moment, he stayed still, letting the quiet of the room sink into him. The fire had burned down to little more than a faint bed of coals, their soft glow barely enough to keep the cold from creeping back in. Noah lay curled on his side, the badge pressed against his chest as though he feared it might vanish if he loosened his grip. Lena's small frame was a faint rise under the blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. Elias watched them for a long moment before standing carefully, his boots making the floorboards sigh under his weight. He crossed to the table and unfolded the note again. The ink had bled slightly where time and damp had touched it, but the words still carried the same quiet weight. If I'm gone, please don't leave the children. They are innocent. Believe them even if no one else will. His fingers brushed over the lines, and he found himself whispering the last sentence under his breath, as though speaking it aloud anchored it more firmly in the room. He folded it again and slipped it into his coat pocket. The plan was forming in his head now. Not clean, not easy, but there. He needed to get Lena somewhere warm, somewhere with real walls and a doctor who wouldn't turn her away. He needed to find Garrett. The old welder had been there the night of the fire, had seen things the report buried, and he needed to look at the records himself. The ones sealed in the council archives. If they still existed, they would tell the story no one else wanted told. A soft sound broke his thoughts. Noah had stirred, his eyes half open, blinking against the dim light. You're still here, the boy murmured, his voice rough. Elias crouched down beside him. Yeah, he said softly. I'm not going anywhere. Noah sat up slowly, the blanket sliding from his shoulders. He looked at the badge in his hands, then at Elias, his gaze sharper now, despite the exhaustion in his face. You believe us. It wasn't a question. Elias held the boy's eyes. I always should have, he said quietly. I won't make that mistake again. Lena coughed faintly, a dry, rasping sound that made both men turn their heads. Elias crossed to her side, kneeling beside the bed. He touched her forehead gently. The heat there made his jaw tighten. She can't stay here, he said, more to himself than them. Not another day. Noah's shoulders tensed. They won't help us. Not in town. Then we won't stay in town, Elias answered. The boy's eyes widened slightly. The first flicker of something like hope crossing his face and vanishing just as quickly like he was afraid to hold it too long. Elias stood and grabbed his coat. "Pack what you can carry," he said quietly. "We're leaving soon." Noah hesitated, then nodded once. He moved slowly through the room, gathering small things: a worn scarf, a cracked cup Lena liked to drink from, a piece of cloth his mother had left behind. He wrapped them carefully, not because they were valuable, but because they were all they had left. Elias stepped outside for a moment. The cold biting harder than it had yesterday. The forest was still, the kind of stillness that comes just before snow. He looked back at the cabin, its crooked frame leaning into the wind, and felt the weight of everything that had happened here pressing against his chest. He turned as Noah stepped onto the porch, the badge tucked into the inside pocket of his shirt. Lena bundled in his arms under the thin blanket. Her eyes blinked open briefly, catching Elias's for the first time fully awake. "Are you coming with us?" she whispered. He met her gaze and gave a small nod. "All the way," he said softly. The boy adjusted his grip on his sister, the rope burn still visible on his palm. For the first time since Elias had found him in the square, his shoulders didn't curve forward under the weight. They squared, just a little against the wind. Elias led the way to the truck. The crunch of their footsteps on frozen earth the only sound. Behind them, the cabin stood silent. Not abandoned, not forgotten, but waiting. The smell of last night's fire still clung to the air, mingling with the faintest trace of old ash, like the house itself knew something long buried had just begun to rise. The truck's engine coughed twice before settling into a low, steady hum. Elias let it idle for a moment, the vibration running through the cold metal frame. Noah sat in the passenger seat, Lena curled against his chest under the olive blanket, her head resting on his shoulder. Her small breaths fogged the glass with each exhale, leaving brief ghosts that faded as quickly as they appeared. Elias adjusted the mirrors out of habit more than need. The dirt track stretched ahead, lined with pines that leaned over like witnesses. He eased the truck forward, tires crunching over the frozen ground, carrying them away from the cabin that had held so much silence. For a while, no one spoke. The engine's hum and the faint creak of the suspension filled the cab. Elias kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts moved elsewhere, back to the square, back to the smell of smoke 5 years ago, back to the moment he saw Daniel Whitaker run into the fire instead of away from it. The scar on Noah's neck had been a spark in dry tinder, igniting everything he'd buried. Noah shifted slightly, careful not to wake his sister. His voice came low, almost cautious. "Where are we going?" Elias's hands tightened on the wheel. "Out of town first. There's a clinic across the county line. They'll treat her." He glanced briefly at Lena, her small frame trembling even under the blanket. "After that, I need to find someone. An old friend who knows what really happened the night of the fire." Noah's eyes flickered toward him, guarded but curious. "Someone who'll believe us?" Elias exhaled slowly. "Someone who saw what I saw, and stayed quiet like I did." The confession left a taste in his mouth, bitter and metallic. The boy looked back down at his sister, his fingers brushing over the edge of the badge under his shirt. "You said my dad didn't run." "I meant it," Elias said, his voice steady despite the heaviness in his chest. "He carried someone out of that fire. He gave everything to get them through the smoke. That's not running." Noah's hand stilled over the badge, his shoulders shaking slightly, not from cold, but from something deeper. "No one ever said that before." "They should have," Elias murmured. The road bent sharply, the trees thinning to reveal the first faint outline of the highway in the distance. Elias slowed as they hit the last stretch of gravel. "When we get to the clinic, I'll stay with her," he said. "You'll both be safe there for a while." Noah's head snapped up, alarm flickering in his tired eyes. "You're not leaving us?" Elias kept his gaze on the road, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you think," Noah began after a long pause, "when people hear the truth, do you think they'll care?" Elias didn't answer right away. He thought of the square, of faces turned away, of reports stamped and filed, of his own silence. "Some will," he said finally. "Some won't. But it doesn't matter. The truth isn't for them. It's for you. For her. For him." Carrying 3 people bound not just by blood or circumstance, but by something heavier. The weight of a fire that refused to die, and the fragile spark of a truth finally ready to burn its way into the open. By the time the first weather-worn sign of the county line appeared through the haze, the snow had grown thicker, each flake drifting slow and heavy as if the sky itself was reluctant to let go. Elias eased the truck to a slower crawl, the tires crunching through the shallow white coating the asphalt. Inside the cab, the air was a fragile balance of engine heat and the faint smell of smoke that clung to his coat. Noah hadn't spoken in nearly half an hour. He sat upright, though exhaustion pulled at his eyelids. One hand, clutching the edge of the olive blanket, wrapped around his sister. Lena's head rested against his shoulder, her lips slightly parted, her breath fogging against his collarbone and slow, cutting through the hum of the engine, but not breaking the stillness. Noah nodded a quick, sharp movement. "She's cold," he said softly. Elias reached behind the seat without looking. The road curved gently, the trees falling away to reveal the first faint silhouette of the clinic in the distance. It was small, tucked against the rise of a hill, its metal roof catching the pale light. Elias felt a knot in his chest loosen slightly at the sight of it, though the weight didn't lift entirely. He knew what waited beyond these walls wasn't just treatment for the girl in the back seat. It was the first step toward unearthing what had been buried. Lena stirred then, her voice a faint rasp. "Are we there?" "Almost," Elias said, soft enough that it sounded like a promise rather than a direction. The boy adjusted his grip on her, tucking the second blanket around her thin shoulders. He looked at the small clinic door, its paint peeling but steady against the snow, and then at the two children beside him. "You ready?" he asked. Noah's answer came without hesitation. "She is." Elias opened the door, the cold rushing in sharp enough to bite. He stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel, and moved quickly around to the passenger side. He reached in, but Noah had already shifted, lifting his sister carefully into his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and for a moment Elias saw Daniel Whitaker in the boy's thin frame, the same protective curl, the same refusal to let go no matter the weight. Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and old wood. The receptionist looked up, her expression shifting the instant she saw the blanket-wrapped girl in Noah's arms. "Exam room 2. She said quickly, no forms, no questions, just motion. Elias followed them down the narrow hall, his boots soft on the worn linoleum. He watched as Noah laid his sister gently on the small bed, his hand never leaving hers, even when the nurse moved in with a stethoscope and quiet instructions. Lena's eyes opened briefly, catching Elias's silhouette in the doorway. "You came," she whispered. He stepped inside fully, his voice steady though his chest tightened. "Told you I would." Noah looked up from the bedside, his face pale but resolute. "You're staying?" Elias's gaze moved between the two of them, the thin girl on the bed and the boy standing guard like a soldier, twice his age. "For as long as it takes," he said. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and unhurried, covering the old tracks on the road behind them. Inside, for the first time in years, the weight of running eased, not gone, but lighter, replaced by the fragile beginning of something neither of them dared to name yet. The first breath of a truth long overdue. The clinic hallway was quiet except for the muffled shuffle of nurses' shoes and the soft hum of the heater. Elias leaned against the wall outside the exam room, his hands buried in his coat pockets, staring at the scuffed linoleum as if it could offer answers. Through the thin door, he could hear Lena's faint cough and the low murmur of the nurse. Noah hadn't left her side once. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen cracked in a corner from some forgotten drop years ago. His thumb hovered over the keypad for a long moment. The name wasn't saved. Gravelly voice came through. "You wouldn't be calling me unless something broke loose." Elias closed his eyes for a beat, the sound of Garrett's voice pulling him back 5 years in an instant. "It's about Glenmore," he said quietly. A pause, then a soft, humorless laugh. "I knew it would be. The fire never really went out, did it?" Elias turned slightly, glancing through the narrow window in the door. Noah sat beside the bed, his hand resting over Lena's. The badge glinted faintly from his shirt pocket in the sterile light. "I found him," Elias said. Silence stretched on the line, thick and heavy. "The boy." Garrett's voice dropped, rougher now, dragging a sack of firewood through Red Willow Square. A long exhale came through the phone. "You saw it, didn't you? That look." Elias's free hand curled against his thigh. Same eyes as that night. Same scar. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "It won't close again. Town won't forgive it. Won't forgive us." Elias's voice came steady, each word laid down like a plank over water. "It's not about forgiveness. It's about truth. Garrett let out a low, tired chuckle. You always were the stubborn one. A pause, then softer. Where are you? County clinic. The girl's in bad shape. I'll get her stable, then I'm coming to you. The old welder's voice dropped to a near whisper. Bring the badge. Bring the boy if he can stand it. I've got something I should have given you 5 years ago. The line clicked dead without goodbye. They said, she'll be okay if we get her medicine. Real medicine. Elias crouched slightly to meet his eyes. We will, he said, the words carrying a quiet promise. We're not leaving her behind. Noah's fingers brushed the edge of the badge in his pocket. Where do we go now? Elias stood, resting a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. To someone who's been waiting to tell the truth. Longer than either of us have been ready to hear it. Outside, the snow had slowed to a light dusting, the kind that softened edges without hiding them. Elias glanced once more at the exam room door, then led Noah down the narrow hall. Each step felt like a hinge turning, a door opening into a past they could no longer ignore. The old highway stretched empty under a sky the color of pewter. The snow had thinned to a fine dust, coating the edges of the road and settling into the shallow grooves of old tire tracks. Elias kept the truck steady at 30, the hum of the engine low against the quiet. Beside him, Noah sat upright, though the olive blanket was still draped over his shoulders. He clutched the badge through the fabric of his shirt, as if to anchor himself against every bump in the road. They'd been driving for nearly an hour when the first outline of the welding shop appeared through the thin mist. It sat hunched at the edge of the tree line, its corrugated tin roof sagging under years of neglect. A wooden sign swung faintly on one bent chain, Garrett's Weld and Fix. The paint was faded to the point of near erasure. Elias slowed the truck, pulling onto the packed dirt lot. The engine noise died into a soft click as he shut it off, leaving the kind of silence that seemed to lean closer to listen. He turned to Noah. You ready? The boy's small nod was quick, tight. He tucked the blanket tighter around himself and followed Elias out into the brittle air. Their boots crunched softly on the frozen ground as they crossed to the workshop door. Elias knocked once. The sound echoed hollow against the metal siding. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the door creaked open just far enough to reveal a single eye under the shadow of a worn cap. You really did it, Garrett said quietly. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. Tools lay neatly on the benches, though a layer of dust softened every edge. In the corner, an old welding torch sat unused, its hoses coiled like a sleeping snake. Noah hovered near Elias's side, until he reached an old steel cabinet tucked behind a stack of bent frames. He pulled a key from his pocket, the metal shaking faintly in his hand as he turned the lock. The door opened with a low groan, releasing a faint smell of ash and old paper. He pulled out a file bound in faded cloth and laid it on the nearest workbench. His fingers lingered on the knot before untying it. Inside, yellowed pages and a single photograph slid onto the table. His breath catching audibly. His fingers hovered over the photo but didn't touch. That's him, he whispered. Garrett's voice was rough when he spoke. The night of the fire. I heard the screams from the East Wing, not where the report said it started. I told them, and the next morning they told me to sign a different statement or lose everything. I signed. Garrett slid the file toward him. Blueprints. Original fire report before they scrubbed it. Names. Dates. Everything they didn't want seen. Noah's small hand finally touched the photo, his thumb brushing the edge carefully as if afraid it might burn him. You kept it, he said, his voice soft, almost reverent. Garrett nodded once. Some things you can't throw into the dark, no matter how much they tell you to. Elias looked at the boy, then at the man across the table. We're not staying quiet another day. The welding torch in the corner caught a stray glint of light, its steel surface gleaming faintly, like a spark waiting to be struck. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the air still and sharp, the world poised on the edge of something about to break open. Garrett's fingers shook slightly as he spread the contents of the file across the scarred workbench. The paper smelled of dust and faint smoke, the kind of scent that clings to things hidden too long. Elias leaned over, his shadow falling across the yellowed pages. Noah stood on tiptoe beside him, His small hand still curled protectively over the photograph of his father running through flame. The first page was a diagram of the council warehouse. Red lines marked ignition points, arrows noting the spread of heat. Elias's brow furrowed as he traced the marks with his finger. East wing, he murmured. Not the west, not the storage room. Garrett gave a short, bitter laugh. Funny thing about fire, it doesn't care where they say it started. It leaves its own map. But that map never made it past my desk. The one you saw in the report? Fabricated before the ashes even cooled. Noah's voice came soft but steady. They blamed him because he was dead. Garrett's gaze landed on the boy, his mouth tightening into something that wasn't quite a wince. They blamed him because he couldn't fight back, and because someone needed the story to end fast. His grip on the page tightened until the old paper crinkled. He passed it to Noah without a word. The boy's eyes scanned the sentence, his lips moving silently over his father's name. His fingers trembled, but he didn't let the page go. Garrett reached for a small, leather-bound notebook at the bottom of the stack. Found this in the debris 2 weeks after they closed the case. Use East Wing. No, electrical trace. Elias's stomach turned. They staged it. Garrett nodded once, his jaw set. Council wanted the records gone. Daniel walked into the wrong building at the wrong time and carried the wrong child out. That's all it took to bury him. The weight of the words filled the shop until even the air felt thick. Elias stepped back, running a hand over his face. 5 years of silence pressed down on him, heavier now because it had a shape, a name, a plan behind it. Noah looked up from the logs, running into heat and smoke because love had left him no other choice. He set his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. We tell it, all of it, no matter who tries to shut us down. Garrett let out a slow breath, almost a sigh. You'll have to tear the town open to do it. Then we tear it open, Elias said quietly. His fingers brushed the corner of the photograph still on the table. For him, for them. Noah's hand tightened over the badge in his pocket. For her, he added softly, glancing toward where Lena slept back at the clinic. Garrett pushed the file toward Elias. Take it. I've been keeping it like a man hiding a live wire. Maybe it's time it burned the right people. His thumb lingering on the blurred outline of Daniel Whitaker's face before closing it. The shop was silent for a long moment. The only sound the faint creak of the roof under the weight of melting snow. Outside, the world looked unchanged, gray sky over white earth, but inside, something had shifted. Elias tucked the file under his arm and looked at Garrett. Tomorrow, we bring it into the light. Garrett gave a single nod, his eyes on the boy clutching the badge. Then tomorrow, the town remembers what it tried to forget. The welding torch in the corner caught the pale light again, its steel surface glinting faintly like the first spark before a fire starts. Not one meant to destroy, but to reveal what had been hidden in the dark too long. But the light did nothing to ease the weight in the cab. The file sat on Elias's lap, the leather cover worn thin at the edges, each sheet inside whispering with every bump in the road. Noah sat quietly beside him, the badge warm now from his grip. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if afraid the town might vanish if he blinked. The olive blanket still wrapped around his shoulders like a second skin. As they crossed the first rusted sign that marked Red Willow's border, Elias felt a shift in the air. It wasn't the cold, though the wind cut sharper here. It was the kind of quiet that comes from years of looking away. He slowed the truck as they passed the first row of houses. It was early enough that only a handful of people were out, an older man sweeping his porch, a woman tugging a reluctant child by the hand. They all stopped when the military truck rolled in. The silence that followed was sharp enough to make the air feel thin. He glanced at Noah. You don't have to walk in there if you don't want to. The boy's small shoulders squared slightly. He didn't run, he said. So I won't either. They stepped out together, boots crunching on the frostbitten dirt. The square looked the same as it had the day before. The butcher's door still flaking paint. The bakery window fogged against the cold. But it felt different now, as if the ground itself was bracing. Garrett was already there, leaning against the warped railing by the well. His cane tapped once against the wood as they approached. Brought it. Elias held up the file. Everything. The old welder's eyes flicked to Noah, then to the badge peeking from his shirt. And everyone. Noah stood a little taller under the gaze, though his hands trembled slightly where they gripped the blanket. Elias looked around the square. No more pretending. Noah stepped closer to the well, his small hand resting on the file. Tomorrow, he echoed, the words soft but steady, like the first strike of a match. The wind swept through the square then, stirring the frost on the ground into faint swirls. It carried the scent of old ash, faint but there. As if the town itself remembered the night, it chose silence over truth. Elias glanced once more at the boy beside him, at the badge catching the pale morning light. For the first time since he'd stepped back into Red Willow, he felt the ground shift, not in fear, but in anticipation, like something long buried was finally pushing its way up through the cold earth. Tomorrow, the square wouldn't just be a place people passed through. Tomorrow, it would be where the fire burned again, not to destroy, but to light what had been left in the dark too long. Elias stood by the truck, his breath fogging in the still air. The file lay on a seat inside, its leather edges worn from years of waiting. Tomorrow it wouldn't be waiting anymore. Noah sat on the steps of the old well, the olive blanket wrapped tight around his shoulders. His small fingers traced the badge over and over, as if memorizing the shape of it in the dark. The thought of her sleeping without the sound of wind slipping through cracked walls steadied him in a way nothing else could. Garrett stood a few feet away, his cane planted firmly in the dirt. He hadn't said much since the shop. Now he broke the silence, his voice low but carrying in the empty square. Garrett let out a soft, humorless laugh. Seeing it isn't the hard part. Living with it is. Noah's voice came from the steps, quiet but certain. We've been living with it. His hand clenched the badge once, hard enough for the metal to bite his palm. Now it's their turn. The old welder looked at him, and something in his face cracked. Not pity, not guilt, but a weary kind of respect. Your father would have been proud, he said softly. Noah shook his head. He'd still be here if they'd listened. The words hit like a hammer on cold steel. Sharp and final. Elias felt them settle into his chest, joining the weight already there. He crouched beside the boy, his voice quiet. Tomorrow isn't about revenge. It's about giving him back what they took. His name, your life, her childhood. Noah's small shoulders rose and fell. Then we can't mess it up. We won't, Elias said, though the promise felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. They stayed in the square long after the wind had gone still. Elias finally moved back to the truck, pulling out a battered thermos. Garrett turned his eyes toward the town hall, its dark windows staring back like blind eyes. You know they'll try to shut it down. Council, sheriff, maybe half the people who show up. Elias glanced at the file resting on the seat, the edges of the old photograph barely visible through the flap. Let them try, he said. The truth doesn't need permission. His small hand steady now around the thermos. Elias looked at him and saw not just the boy, but the shadow of a man who'd been forced to carry too much too soon. Tomorrow would break something open in this town. It would break something open in all of them. He reached over and rested a hand lightly on Noah's shoulder. Get some rest. Tomorrow. The square behind them holding its breath. In the stillness, the faint scent of old smoke lingered in the air, curling through the cold like a reminder. Some fires don't die. They wait. And in a few hours, red willows would burn again. Not in wooden flame, but in truth. Morning broke slow over Red Willow, the first light seeping into the frost like it wasn't sure it belonged. Around him, the town began to gather, drawn not by invitation, but by something older, a pull they couldn't name. Noah stood a few feet away, the olive blanket folded neatly over his shoulders. The badge hung outside his shirt now, its bronze surface catching the thin slice of sunlight breaking through the clouds. His small fingers held it steady, though his shoulders trembled slightly under cold. Garrett was beside him, leaning on his cane, the old welder's jaw tight as the first murmurs rippled through the crowd. The butcher came first, wiping his hands on a stained apron. Then the baker, her face pale beneath the wool scarf. Mrs. Mullins stood at the edge, her eyes flicking once to Noah and then down to the ground as if the dirt could shield her. The square filled slow, cautious footsteps crunching on frost, voices dropping to whispers that carried like smoke. Elias opened the file without speaking, the flap creaking softly. He set the first sheet on the well's edge, the blueprint of the warehouse. The red marks like scars across the page. Then the radio log, Daniel Whitaker's name scrawled in the margin. Then the photograph, the one that had survived smoke and time, laid gently on top. Noah stepped forward, his breath fogging in the thin air. He didn't speak at first. His hand hovered over the photograph, then settled on it. 5 years ago, a man ran into fire, not away from it. He carried life through smoke and heat. And we let them call him a criminal because it was easier than looking at the truth. He lifted the radio log, his thumb brushing Daniel's name. We let silence bury him, and we let it bury them. His eyes flicked to Noah. No more. Garrett's voice joined his. Daniel Whitaker died, saving a child while they rewrote the story before the embers cooled. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone shifted. Someone else let out a sharp breath. But no one stepped forward to deny it. Noah's small voice carried clearer than either of theirs. He didn't run. He didn't leave us. You did. His fingers tightened on the badge until his knuckles whitened. But we're still here. The words hung in the air like smoke refusing to rise. Mrs. Mullins's knees buckled slightly. The baker reached to steady her, but she shook him off, her eyes wet, her lips trembling around words she couldn't form. Elias looked at the boy beside him and saw not just grief, but a spark, thin, fragile, but burning. He placed a hand gently on Noah's shoulder. Today, he said softly, we give him back his name. The church bell struck once in the distance, the sound carrying over the roofs and into the square. No one moved. No one spoke. And for the first time in 5 years, Red Willow's silence didn't hide the truth. It held it, heavy and undeniable, steadying the boy not just against the cold, but against the weight of every eye in the square. The file lay open on the well's edge, his cane tapping once against the frozen ground. For 5 years, he said, his voice carrying more gravel than air. It just kept him dead. His hand gestured toward Noah, then to the badge glinting on the boy's chest. Not today. Not another damn day. The words broke something loose. Mrs. Mullins moved first, her hands trembling as she stepped into the center. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight, but her knees bent slowly until she knelt in the frost. Her voice cracked as it left her. Forgive me, she whispered, not to Elias or Garrett, but to the boy clutching the badge. We turned away. We all did. Noah's breath hitched. His hand tightened over the metal, his shoulders curling slightly forward as if trying to hold the moment together. His voice, when it came, was soft but clear. You didn't see him. He glanced down at the photograph under his fingers. He ran in a fire for us, for someone he didn't even know. He didn't run away. Not once. A man at the edge of the crowd dropped his hat into his hands. The baker pressed her fingers to her lips, eyes shining. One by one, the townsfolk shifted, their silence no longer the hard shell of denial, but the brittle kind before something breaks open. Elias reached for the file and lifted the radio log high enough for all to see. His name was Daniel Whitaker. He died saving a child while the council burned the truth with their records. They told you a story to make it clean. This, he held up the charred photograph, is what really happened. Garrett's voice followed, low and steady. And this boy, he gestured to Noah, has carried that lie on his back every step through this square. Every sack of firewood. Every cold morning you turned your faces away. Today it stops. Noah's small shoulders shook once, then stilled. His fingers brushed the edge of the photograph before lifting the badge high enough for the weak sun to catch it. His voice cracked, but the words didn't falter. My dad wasn't a criminal. He was the only one who didn't leave. The sound that followed wasn't applause. It wasn't even words. It was the low murmur of a crowd exhaling something it had held for 5 years, the sharp crack of a wall breaking under its own weight. Mrs. Mullins's sob carried first, thin and raw. Then another voice joined, and another, not in denial, not an argument, but in the quiet grief of people seeing themselves in a mirror for the first time. Elias bent slightly. I just told the truth, he whispered. The square stayed silent after that. Not the cold silence of forgetting, but the heavy kind that comes when truth finally finds air. Above them, the pale sky held steady, the faint scent of old smoke curling through the frost like a promise. Some fires don't burn to destroy. Some burn to bring the lost home. The crowd didn't move at first. The square held them the way a deep breath holds the chest, everything suspended between what had been and what came next. Elias lowered the file, slowly. His hands steady despite the trembling in his gut. Years of silence had a weight, and now, for the first time, he felt it shifting off his shoulders, spreading into the air around them like smoke breaking apart. Noah stepped back half a pace, his fingers still wrapped around the badge. The frost crunched under his boots. a small sound in the vast quiet. He glanced at Elias, then at the photograph resting on the well. His lips parted like he might speak, but no words came. Instead, he reached out and touched the corner of the photo with one trembling finger. I thought if I said his name too much, the boy whispered, his voice thin in the cold, it would hurt worse. Say it then, he said, his voice rough but carrying. Noah's shoulders rose and fell with a shallow breath. He closed his eyes and let the word out soft, steady. The name moved through the square like a spark. A murmur followed, low, hesitant but there. Someone repeated it, then another. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a chant. It was a ripple of recognition. A town saying a name it had buried and finding it still alive on their tongues. Elias felt his chest tighten as the sound threaded through the cold air. He had heard battlefields fall quiet before, had felt the weight of moments that split lives into before and after. This was different, softer, but no less final. Mrs. Mullins wiped her face with the edge of her scarf. I saw him that night. Noah's eyes opened slowly, meeting hers. There was no accusation in them, only the kind of tired clarity that comes when the truth finally stands without leaning on anyone. Garrett stepped forward, at the small frame that had carried the weight of a town's silence, and felt something uncoil inside him. He bent slightly, his voice just for Noah. You did it. Noah shook his head faintly, his breath curling in the cold. He did it. We just finally saw him. The wind shifted then, sweeping through the square and carrying the faintest trace of old ash mixed with the sharp scent of frost. Elias closed his eyes for a beat, letting it brush his face. When he opened them, he saw the town differently. Not redeemed, not absolved, but cracked open just enough for something new to grow. He reached for the file, sliding the photograph gently back inside. The leather felt lighter in his hands now, as if the weight had shifted somewhere else. Not gone, but shared. Garrett's voice broke the silence again. What now? Elias looked at the boy clutching the badge, and then at the faces around the square, some wet with tears, some pale with shock, all waiting. His answer was quiet but steady. Now we start living with the truth instead of running from it. Noah tucked the badge close to his chest and nodded once. The frost underfoot crackled softly, as if agreeing. Above them, the pale winter sky held still, a muted blue washed clean. For the first time, it felt like a ceiling lifting. The square thinned slowly after the name had been spoken aloud. No one left quickly. They moved like people stepping out of church after a long prayer, their boots crunching over frost in soft, uneven rhythms. No one dared speak too loud, as if sound itself might shatter what had settled in the air. Elias stayed by the well, the file tucked under one arm. The cold bit through his coat now, but he barely felt it. He watched Noah, who hadn't moved from his spot. The boy stood with his hand over the badge, his breath fogging slow and steady. The olive blanket had slipped off one shoulder, and he didn't seem to notice. Garrett shifted closer, his cane sinking slightly into the frozen dirt. You should get the girl, he said quietly. Let her see it. Let her hear it before the air goes back to what it was. Elias nodded. Clinic's not far. I'll bring her. Noah turned his head at that, his voice small but steady. She needs to know they said his name. She will, Elias said. And for the first time since stepping into Red Willow, the words didn't feel like a promise weighed down by doubt. They drove back in near silence. The truck's engine a low hum under the soft crunch of tires over frost. The clinic's small light glowed faint yellow against the gray morning. Inside, Lena lay propped on thin pillows, her cheeks still pale, but carrying a faint flush of real warmth. When she saw Noah step through the doorway, the corners of her mouth lifted in the smallest, tired smile. You came back, she whispered. Noah crossed to her side and pressed the badge into her hand without a word. Her fingers curled around it, thin and fragile but certain. Elias stood in the doorway, his voice soft. We said his name. Lena's eyes widened slightly, the pale blue brightening just a touch. Out loud, Noah answered, his own voice breaking on the words. Everyone heard it. He never was. It just made you carry the silence for him. For a moment, none of them spoke. The nurse moved softly in the background, adjusting a drip line, but even her hands seemed to move slower, quieter, as if she understood something fragile was being held in that small room. Noah brushed a strand of hair from his sister's forehead, his fingers trembling. "You can rest now," he whispered. "You don't have to keep saying it just to me anymore." Lena blinked up at him, her lips curving in a faint smile. "I told Mama someone would hear it one day." Her voice was barely a thread, but it held something strong beneath it. Elias felt his chest tighten, a knot loosening somewhere deep where he'd buried too much for too long. He reached for the chair by the bed and sat, his hands resting on his knees. For the first time since the fire, he didn't feel like he was trespassing in someone else's grief. He felt like he was finally standing where he was supposed to. Garrett's voice came from the doorway, softer than Elias had ever heard it. "Tomorrow we build him a marker, not a grave, a place to stand and say his name without shame." Noah nodded, his hand still over his sister's. "And a place to leave the sack." Elias looked at him, understanding instantly. The boy wasn't talking about firewood. He was talking about the weight, the years, the silence. "Yeah," Elias said, his voice low. "A place to leave it all behind." Outside, the snow had stopped. The air carried that fragile stillness that comes not after a storm, but after something long buried finds its way to the surface. Inside that small clinic room, for the first time in 5 years, warmth didn't come from fire. It came from a sound of a name no longer hidden in whispers. The next morning broke with a thin veil of fog clinging low to the ground, wrapping the edges of Red Willow in muted gray. Elias stood at the edge of the field just beyond the clinic, his boots sinking slightly into the thawing earth. The old pine trees lined the slope like quiet sentinels. Garrett was already there, leaning heavily on his cane, a bundle of wood stakes and a single sheet of metal laid out beside him. Noah trudged up the slope slowly, the olive blanket draped over his shoulders, Lena in his arms. Her small head rested against his collarbone, eyes still heavy with exhaustion, but awake enough to follow the movement of the trees around them. The badge hung around her neck now, the soil darker, richer where the fire had once licked the edge of the forest. He pressed his palm into the ground, feeling the dampness seep into his skin. "Here," he said softly. Garrett lowered himself slowly, his knees protesting. "Good as any place. Better than most." His voice carried no ceremony, just a quiet finality. He handed Elias the first stake, and together they set the rough frame into the earth. It wasn't grand, just 4 simple pieces of wood and a plate of metal etched with a single name, Daniel Whitaker. Noah knelt beside the marker, shifting Lena gently so she could see it. Her fingers reached out, brushing the edge of the metal, and she whispered something so soft Elias almost didn't catch it. "You're not lost anymore." Just a handful of old, split logs bundled in burlap, the last pieces from the pile he had dragged through town for 3 long winters. He lifted the sack slowly and set it down in front of the marker. His hands lingered on the rough fabric, fingers brushing the frayed edges. "This was all we had," he said, his voice low but steady. "I thought if I carried it long enough, maybe someone would see us. Maybe they'd hear us." He looked up at the simple marker, his eyes wet but unflinching. "You can rest now. We don't need it anymore." Elias stepped forward and laid his hand gently over the boy's. "Warms the ground again." Garrett placed a smooth stone on top of the metal plate, his rough fingers lingering for a second. "Not a grave," he said softly. "A place to stand. A place to remember." Noah mirrored him, picking up a small stone from the edge of the slope and placing it gently beside Garrett's. Lena reached out with her tiny hand, dropping a pine cone next to the stones, her lips curving in the faintest smile. "For him to hold," she whispered. They stood there in the fog, the marker simple against the muted gray of the morning. No speeches, no ceremony, just a boy, a girl, a soldier, and an old welder standing over a name that had finally been pulled out of the ashes. Elias let the quiet stretch. "This," he gestured to the marker, "this is where life comes back to him." The wind moved through the pines then, a low, soft sound that brushed over them like an answer. It carried no heat, no ash, just the first hint of something new settling into the soil. For the first time in 5 years, Red Willow had a place where truth could stand without fear. By the time they made it back down the slope, the fog had begun to lift. Sunlight pushed through in thin, hesitant lines, catching on the frost still clinging to the grass. Elias walked a few steps behind Noah and Lena, his eyes fixed on the small figure of the boy carrying his sister. It wasn't the weight of her body that struck him, It was how carefully he held her, as if the act itself might keep her tethered to the world. Garrett trailed at the rear, his cane tapping softly against the thawing ground. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It felt like something that needed to be held gently, not filled too quickly. At the edge of the square, the townsfolk waited. Not all had gone home after the marker. They stood in small clusters, their faces marked by something rawer than shame. The butcher had removed his apron, his hands scrubbed but still stained. Mrs. Mullins held a white handkerchief crushed in her fist, its fabric damp. The baker clutched a paper bag of bread she hadn't thought to deliver. Noah slowed as they approached, his steps careful. He stopped just shy of the well, his voice carrying softly but with enough weight to settle over the square. What you do now matters more than what you didn't do before. Mrs. Mullins stepped forward first. Noah's fingers brushed the badge absently, his eyes never leaving hers. He gave a single small nod. One by one, others stepped forward. A man brought a lantern blackened by smoke. An older woman placed a smooth stone, whispering something only she and the earth heard. Each piece was small, ordinary, but in the cold air of Red Willow, they felt like something more, like fragments of a wall finally breaking down. Garrett watched it all, his hand tightening slightly on his cane. They're not fixing it, he murmured to Elias. They're choosing what to carry now. Elias nodded. That's all any of us can do. Noah shifted Lena carefully, letting her lean against his chest as she clutched the mitten. Her voice was a faint whisper. It's warmer here than our cabin. Elias crouched beside them, his eyes on the boy. You know why? Noah shook his head. Because you're not carrying it alone anymore. For a moment, the square was quiet again, not the silence of denial, but the soft hum of something mending. The frost underfoot began to soften, and the pale sunlight spread a little wider over the crowd. Elias stood, looking over the faces of Red Willow. This isn't the end, he said quietly. Truth isn't something you stand in once. It's something you live with every day. His eyes found Noah again, and it starts with choosing what you keep. The boy looked down at the badge, then at his sister clutching the mitten. Slowly, he exhaled. Then we keep him, and we keep each other. The wind stirred through the square, light and cold, carrying away the last trace of smoke lingering in the air. For the first time, it didn't smell like fire. It smelled like earth ready to grow again. The old cabin stood silent when they returned, leaning slightly as if it had exhaled after years of holding itself together. The wind moved through the gaps in the boards, carrying the familiar sound of a place that had seen too much cold. Elias stood on the porch for a moment, his hand brushing the frame of the door. This won't be your last winter here, he murmured, though it wasn't a promise to the wood. It was to the two children standing just behind him. Noah stepped past him first, Lena still in his arms. Her eyes scanned the small space as if seeing it for the first time since the square. The cracked walls, the thin bed, the stack of split wood in the corner. It was the same cabin. Garrett followed last, ducking slightly under the low frame. He leaned his cane against the wall and let out a slow breath. Looks smaller now, he said softly. It isn't, Elias replied. We just aren't carrying it the same way. Noah lowered his sister onto the bed, tucking the olive blanket around her shoulders. She curled into it, her fingers still holding tight to the mitten. He crouched beside her, brushing a hand over her hair. You're home, he whispered. Lena blinked up at him. It feels different. Noah smiled faintly, the expression soft and unfamiliar on his tired face. It is. Elias crossed the room and crouched near the small fireplace. The embers from before had long since died, leaving only a faint gray ash. He set a new log in, striking a match and holding it steady until the flame caught. The fire crackled softly, the sound filling the small space like a breath drawn in for the first time. Garrett lowered himself onto the old chair in the corner, his cane resting across his lap. What now? He asked, his voice quiet. Not in doubt, but in the way people ask about the shape of tomorrow when today has already changed everything. Elias looked at the two children huddled by the fire. We start small. Warmth. Food. Lena shifted under the blanket, her eyes half closed now. Will we stay here forever? She murmured. Elias glanced around the cabin. The rough walls, the uneven floorboards. the smell of smoke that would probably never fully leave. "No," he said softly, "just long enough to make it stop feeling like a place you had to survive." The girl's lips curved faintly. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. "Not just this place. All of it." Garrett's voice was low but steady. "Then this is where it starts." Inside the cabin, the fire popped softly, sending a small spray of sparks upward. Noah sat with his back against the bed, his sister curled beside him. His hand rested over the badge on her chest. For the first time in years, the weight of it didn't press down. It anchored them instead, not to loss, but to a name returned and a life still ahead. Elias closed the door against the cold, letting the fire's glow fill the room. The house wasn't warm yet, but for the first time, it wasn't just holding out against the cold. It was learning how to hold light. 2 weeks passed before the first boards were laid. The snow had melted into patches of damp earth, leaving the clearing behind the cabin soft and ready. Elias stood in the mud with a borrowed hammer in his hand. His coat sleeves rolled and boots caked with the thaw. Garrett measured out the frame of what would one day be more than a shelter. "Doesn't have to be perfect," the old welder muttered, his pencil scratching over a piece of wood. "Just has to stand." Noah crouched near a pile of nails, carefully sorting them into an old tin can. Lena sat on a blanket nearby. Elias drove the first nail into the baseboard. The sound echoed faintly off the pines, a sharp ring of steel against wood that didn't feel like building walls, but tearing down something invisible. He straightened and looked at Noah. "You ready for this?" The boy nodded, his small fingers gripping the tin can tight. "Ready to make it ours." They worked slow, his eyes fixed on the grain like he saw something in the wood only he could read. By the time the frame stood, rough and skeletal, the sun had dipped low, turning the clearing gold. Elias set the hammer down and stepped back. The structure was nothing yet, just wood and nails, raw edges and open sky. But in the space between the boards, he could already see it. A roof that didn't leak, walls that didn't lean, warmth that didn't come from desperation. Noah moved closer to the frame, his fingers brushing one of the upright beams. He glanced at Elias. "Will it last?" Elias crouched beside him, his hand over the boys on the wood. "If we build it right, it won't just last. It'll outlive us." The boy nodded slowly, his shoulders easing in a way Elias hadn't seen before. That night, they lit a small fire in the clearing, sitting in a rough circle around it. Garrett handed out cups of weak coffee and thin soup, steam curling into the cool air. Lena held her cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "This is what home feels like," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but certain. A small sound in the stillness. "Closer's good enough for tonight." The fire crackled, throwing thin sparks into the dark. Noah leaned back against Elias's side without a word, the boy's small weight settling like trust finally finding a place to rest. Above them, the trees swayed gently, and for the first time, the clearing didn't feel like the edge of survival. The slow crunch of boots on thawing ground carrying through the still air. He straightened from the half-built wall, wiping his hands on his coat. Mrs. Mullins appeared first. Others trailed in behind them. Faces Elias had only seen turn away before now, meeting his eyes without flinching. Garrett leaned on his cane, his mouth twitching in something close to a smile, his fingers curling slightly against the cold metal. Lena shifted on the blanket beside him, blinking against the pale light. "Are they here for us?" Noah didn't answer right away. His voice, when it came, was soft but sharp as a breath drawn in the cold. "They're here for him." His hand touched the badge hanging around his sister's neck. Mrs. Mullins stepped into the clearing, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. She set a bundle of nails beside Noah without a word. The boy glanced up at her, his shoulders tense. "I can't undo it," she said quietly, "but I can hold a wall." The baker set down her card, pulling back the cloth to reveal loaves still warm from the oven. "You'll need food if you're going to build something that lasts." The weight of what wasn't said heavier than any apology. He nodded once, picking up the hammer again. "Then let's build." They worked in near silence at first, the only sounds the ring of nails, the creak of wood, and the soft shifting of feet over damp earth. It wasn't perfect. The walls leaned more than once, the planks splintered under rough hands and used to building anything but distance. But every time something wavered, someone caught it. Garrett barked instructions from his chair, his voice rough but steady. Elias held beams steady while the butcher hammered. Mrs. Mullins stood shoulder to shoulder with Noah, guiding his small hands as they set the first real wall in place. Lena watched from her blanket, her eyes bright despite the fever still lingering in her cheeks. By midday, the frame had doubled, the skeleton of a roof beginning to take shape. Noah stepped back, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. His breath came in short puffs, his shoulders heaving. Lena's voice floated from the blanket. "It looks like a home." Noah turned to her, his lips pressing together before curving into a small, unsteady smile. "It's going to be." Elias glanced at the gathering around him. The same people who had once stepped around a boy collapsed in the dirt, now standing with hands raw from lifting, faces marked not by shame, but by the first thin lines of redemption. The sun dipped lower, painting the half-built walls in gold. Garrett's cane tapped once against the ground. "A house is wood and nails," he said softly. "A home is when people choose to stay." Noah's gaze moved over the frame, then to the faces around him. For the first time, the clearing didn't feel like the edge of a forgotten town. It felt like the center of something beginning to heal, one beam, one nail, one quiet choice at a time. By the end of the week, the walls stood solid, raw with catching every pale stripe of winter light. Elias ran his hand over the frame of what would be a window, the rough grain splintering slightly under his fingers. "Needs glass," he murmured, though his voice held more weight than the words alone. Windows meant light. Windows meant you weren't hiding anymore. Garrett shuffled in behind him, cane tapping against the unfinished floor. Already talked to the old glazier in town. Said he'd cut it himself. Didn't even ask for payment. Just asked if it would face east. Elias nodded. "East is good. Let the sun hit first thing in the morning." Noah crouched near the corner, his small hands pressing nails into place while Mrs. Mullins steadied the board. The boy's face was smudged with dirt and faint streaks of sawdust. His shoulders moved with quiet focus, each swing of the hammer slow and deliberate. Lena sat propped against a stack of blankets, her legs tucked under a patchwork quilt someone from town had left on the porch. Elias smiled faintly. "Then that's where the bed goes." They spent the day setting the last of the beams, the structure finally beginning to look like something that could hold more than just bodies. It could hold life. The townsfolk filtered in and out, bringing food, tools, sometimes just their hands. Each nail driven into the wood sounded different now. Not a patch over survival, but the quiet ring of something being restored. As dusk bled into the clearing, Elias stepped outside to gather the last stack of planks. He paused on the porch, looking back into the unfinished room. The fire they'd lit in the center cast warm, uneven light over the bare walls. His head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. Elias stepped back inside and crouched by the window frame. "You know," he said softly, "I think this room is going to hold more mornings than any of us can count." Noah tilted his head, his small hand resting on the badge hanging around his sister's neck. "Then we'll fill them." Garrett let out a low chuckle, the sound like gravel smoothing underwater. "Funny thing about light, it doesn't ask what's shining on. It just comes." Lena smiled faintly, her eyes half closed. "Then let it come here." They worked until the last bit of daylight faded, the fire's glow filling in what the sun left behind. When Elias finally set the last plank down, he stood in the doorway and looked at the room once more. It was still unfinished, the floor uneven, the roof not yet sealed, but with the frame of the window cut into the east wall and two small figures sitting under its future light, it already felt like what Lena had whispered earlier, a home. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, soft and low. Inside, the air held warmth that didn't come from fire alone. Clear morning. Elias carried the panels himself, cradling them against his chest as if they were more fragile than bone. The glazier, a quiet man with hands permanently dusted white from years of cutting, followed with a small satchel of putty and tools. He didn't speak as they worked, only nodded once when the first pane slid into the east-facing frame. Noah stood a few feet back, his fingers wrapped around a mug of thin coffee Mrs. Mullins had pressed into his hands. He watched the glazier's movements like a hawk, his small shoulders rigid, as if afraid to breathe until the last piece was sealed. Lena sat propped on the patchwork quilt, his voice soft as the frost outside. Then he packed his tools and left without asking for anything more than a nod from Elias. They didn't wait until tomorrow. Elias moved to the window, wiped a smudge from the glass with the edge of his sleeve, and stepped aside. "Go on," he said gently. Noah crossed the unfinished floor, his small boots tapping on the boards, and crouched in front of the window. He leaned in, pressing his palm against the cool glass. "It's clear," he whispered, as if that alone was a miracle. Lena struggled upright, Noah's arm bracing her carefully until she was seated beside him. Her fingers trembled slightly as they touched the pane. "It feels different," she said softly. Elias crouched behind them, his voice low. "That's because you're not looking through cracks anymore. You're looking through something made to let the light in." For a long moment, they sat in silence, just breathing in the quiet of the room. Garrett shifted in his chair, the cane resting across his lap. 5 years, he murmured, and now they'll wake up to the same sun their father saw last, spilling soft gold across the bare walls. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a thin line of light stretching across rough wood, and 2 small figures huddled close. Lena let out a soft sound, halfway between a sigh and a laugh. "It's warm," she whispered. Noah leaned his forehead gently against the pane. "Then we did it right." Elias stood slowly, letting the moment settle into the room like dust on still air. He glanced at Garrett, who gave the smallest nod, his eyes fixed on the thin ribbon of sunlight. The boy turned then. They stayed there until the sun climbed higher, filling the room with a pale, growing warmth. The fire in the corner burned low, but no one moved to feed it. For the first time, they didn't need the fire to chase the cold away. Outside, the pines swayed gently, their branches catching the same light. Inside, the room held its first morning through glass, and for a quiet, steady moment, it felt like the house itself had taken its first breath. The next project wasn't a wall or a roof beam. It was a table. Garrett suggested it one afternoon as they stood in the half-finished room, the air thick with sawdust and faint traces of smoke from the fire. "Every house needs a place to sit," he said, his cane tapping once against the floorboards. "A place where hands can rest and not just work." Elias scavenged the wood from the last stack near the old cabin, boards worn smooth from years of being stepped over. "Feels right," he murmured, running his hand over the grain. "Something old to hold something new." Noah helped sand the planks, his small hands moving in slow, deliberate strokes. Lena sat nearby, sorting the nails into neat rows on a piece of cloth. Her voice floated soft into the cool air. "Can we make it long enough for everyone?" Elias glanced at her, then at the boy beside him. "For everyone who chooses to sit," he said gently. They built it over 2 days. No blueprint, no measurements beyond what felt right. Garrett sat in his chair, offering instructions in his rough voice, though half the time his eyes lingered on the children more than the wood. When the last nail was driven in, they carried the table into the center of the unfinished room. It wasn't perfect. One leg leaned slightly, the surface dipped a fraction to the left. But when Elias set his hands on it, the weight of it felt right. That evening, the townsfolk returned, bringing food wrapped in cloth, jars of preserves, loaves still warm. Mrs. Mullins carried a pot of stew that smelled of herbs and something deeper, a quiet attempt at making up for winters gone wrong. The baker placed a basket of bread in the center, her hands lingering there a moment before she stepped back. Noah guided Lena to the table, helping her into the first chair. He stood beside her, his small hand resting on the back of the seat. His eyes swept over the rough surface, the bowls, the bread, the stew. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he pulled the badge from around Lena's neck and set it gently in the center of the table. "This is his seat," he said quietly. The room stilled. Elias lowered himself into a chair, his gaze on the small piece of metal catching the firelight. Garrett leaned forward, his fingers tapping once against the wood. "Every house needs a place for the ones who aren't here," he murmured. Lena's small fingers brushed the edge of the badge. "He is here," she whispered. Elias reached out, his hand covering hers briefly. "He always will be." They ate in near silence, the kind that doesn't come from discomfort, but from reverence. The stew warmed their hands. The bread softened in their mouths. But it was the table itself that held the weight of the evening. It wasn't just wood. It was a place where grief could sit without being turned away, where names could be spoken without fear of them breaking in the air. When the bowls were empty and the fire burned low, Noah stood, his hand still resting on the badge. He looked at Elias. "We're keeping this table forever." Elias smiled faintly. Tables like this don't get thrown out. They get passed down. Outside, the cold clung to the pines, the night settling deep and still. Inside, the rough wooden table held the first meal of a new home, and for a moment, it felt as though the house itself leaned closer, listening. The roof went on just as the last of the winter wind began to ease. Elias stood on the ladder, hammer in hand, the smell of pine tar and coldwood heavy in the air. Below, Garrett leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his teeth. Now I can keep the sky off their heads, he murmured, his cane tapping once against the packed dirt. Inside, the fire burned low, a thin ribbon of smoke curling toward the ceiling that no longer opened to the gray. The room felt different immediately. Not warmer, not yet, but contained. Safe in a way it hadn't been before. As dusk settled, the townsfolk drifted away in quiet steps, leaving behind blankets, jars of food, and small offerings they didn't speak about, smooth stones, bits of cloth. A few nails left in neat piles. Mrs. Mullins pressed a small oil lamp into Noah's hands before she left. For the dark, she said simply, and her voice broke slightly on the word. When the last set of footsteps faded into the trees, Elias closed the door gently. The sound of it clicking into place was softer than the final nail, but it carried the same weight. Noah stood in the center of the room, Lena curled in the chair beside the fire, her eyes heavy but still watching the roof as if to make sure it stayed. Elias crouched beside her, adjusting the quilt around her thin shoulders. "You're sleeping inside tonight," he said softly. Her lips curved faintly. "It's inside now." He smiled. "It is." Listening to the sound of their breathing settle into the room, Garrett dozed lightly in his chair, the cane balanced against his knee. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pines. For the first time since he'd stepped into Red Willow, the night didn't feel like something to brace against. It felt like something settling, before sleep claimed him. The house held it all, the soft crackle of fire, the slow, even breaths of two children finally safe enough to sleep, the weight of a name no longer buried in ash. Outside, the night folded gently around the clearing, and for the first time in years, the darkness wasn't heavy. It was simply night, and they were simply home. The thaw came slowly to Red Willow, creeping in through soft patches of earth and the first timid shoots of green pressing against the cold soil. Elias stood on the porch of the new house, his hands braced on the railing they'd built from leftover planks. The wood was still rough under his palms, but it held. Behind him, the sound of quiet laughter, a sound the walls had never held before, drifted through the doorway. Noah stepped outside, wiping sawdust from his fingers onto the hem of his shirt. His eyes swept over the clearing, the pines, the faint trace of the old cabin still visible beyond the trees. "It smells different," he said softly. Elias nodded. "That's spring." He glanced at the boy. "First one, that belongs to you." Lena appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. Her legs were still weak, but the new braces the clinic had provided let her stand longer each day. The badge hung loose around her neck, clinking softly against the wood as she shifted. "Is it going to stay?" she asked, her voice quiet. Elias turned toward her. "What?" "This feeling." Her fingers brushed the edge of the frame. "Like we don't have to run anymore." For a long moment, Elias didn't answer. He looked at the boy beside him, the girl in the doorway, the simple house behind them built from the hands of people who once turned away. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle in his chest. "If you keep choosing it," he said finally, "yeah, it'll stay." Garrett joined them a moment later, came tapping softly on the new porch boards. He lowered himself onto the step with a slow, careful motion and let out a breath that sounded like a man laying something down. "Feels different standing here," he murmured. "Like the ground remembers, but it's willing to forgive." Noah crouched at the edge of the porch, his fingers brushing the dirt where frost had given way to damp earth. He dug a small hole with his thumb and set a pine seed in the soft soil. "For him," he said quietly. Elias crouched beside him, covering the seed with a gentle press of his hand. "For all of you," he added. Lena smiled faintly, her hands gripping the frame for balance. "Can I plant one too?" Garrett handed her a seed from his pocket, his rough fingers surprisingly careful. "Every home needs roots," he said, his voice almost a whisper. They worked in silence, planting 3 small seeds in the soft earth at the porch's edge. The wind stirred through the pines, carrying the faint scent of thawed soil and old wood. When they stepped back inside, the fire was already lit, the table waiting with the badge still resting at its center. Noah brushed his fingers over it as he passed, the small clink of metal against what sounding like a promise. That night, as the fire burned low and the first crickets of the season began to hum outside, Elias sat with his back against the new wall. The house no longer smelled of raw wood and ash. It smelled of something else now, of soil, of fire burned clean, of the first hint of green pressing its way up through old earth. Elias stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. The house smelled of fresh wood and smoke from the fire they had kept burning all day. Garrett sat at the table, his hands folded over the cane resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on the badge lying in the center as though it were still glowing. Noah knelt near the hearth. Lena sat in the chair beside the window, her thin legs resting on a stool, her eyes following the light spilling in through the glass. Elias crossed the room and set the last piece of trim into place. The soft scrape of wood against what echoed like a closing chapter. He let his hand linger on the frame, wiping his hands on his worn shirt. His gaze drifted to the table, to the badge resting there, and then back to Elias. What happens now? Elias crouched beside him, the firelight painting his face in warm gold and shadow. Now you live in it. You fill it with mornings and nights, and everything in between until the walls know your names better than the old ones. The boy's fingers brushed a stray chip of wood from the floor. And him. He nodded toward the badge. Elias's voice softened. He stays. Not in this metal. In you. Lena's quiet voice broke the silence. Mama used to say a house remembers the hands that build it. She tilted her head toward the window, the faint line of planted seeds just visible in the dusk. The townsfolk filtered in slowly, not with fanfare, but with quiet steps, bringing bread, soup, and their own hands to rest on the wood. No one spoke of the fire, or the years of silence, or the weight that had been carried too long. They spoke of small things, the sound of the creek thawing, the first hint of green on the hill, the way the new roof didn't creak even in the wind. When the bowls were emptied and the fire burned to embers, Elias rose. He walked to the table, lifted the badge, and held it in his palm. The metal was warm from the heat of the room, from all the hands that had brushed against it. He turned to Noah and placed it gently in his small hand. This isn't a weight anymore, he said softly. It's a name. Keep it the way you keep light in a window. Noah closed his fingers around it slowly, his lips pressing into a thin line that curved, almost, into a smile. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of new earth through the pines. Inside, the house stood steady, holding the warmth of fire and the quiet heartbeat of a home no longer defined by loss. Later, when everyone else had gone, Elias stepped out onto the porch alone. The moonlight touched the 3 small mounds of soil where seeds had been planted. He crouched and pressed his hand to the earth. Stay, he whispered, not to the house, not to the ground, but to the moment itself. Behind him, the soft sound of Noah's footsteps came, followed by the lighter tap of Lena's braces. They didn't speak. They simply stood beside him, 3 hands resting on the same stretch of soil. In the cool night air, the new house breathed with them, holding everything they chose to keep and everything they were finally able to set down. The house at the edge of the pines never became a monument. It was just wood and glass and the soft hum of life settling into walls that had once known only silence. But if you stepped close on a still evening, you could hear something in the way the floor held footsteps, in the way the windows caught the first morning light. It was the sound of people choosing to stay. Elias sat on the porch long after the fire had gone out, listening to the quiet that no longer carried weight. Inside, 2 small breaths rose and fell in unison, a badge resting on a windowsill where the dawn would touch it first. He exhaled slowly, not as a soldier, not as a man making amends, but simply as someone who had learned what home really meant. Not the place you return to, but the people who let you. And maybe that's what healing really is, not erasing the fire or the years of carrying too much, but finding hands steady enough to set it down with. If you've ever carried something alone for too long, or if there's a name you haven't spoken out loud in years because it hurt too much to hear, tell me in the comments. Tell me so I can hold it with you for a while. Sometimes, healing begins with one person willing to listen and one voice brave enough to break the silence.